Okay, here's our video on floating bar graphs. Okay, so we're familiar with bar graphs, right? This is a bar graph. This is a horizontal bar graph. They don't have to be horizontal. They could be vertical like this. Normally you'll see them vertical. So again, vertical or horizontal. And you notice they start at 0 and they move up. But in inequalities, they don't always start at 0. So we'll look at an example here with the average temperature. So this is a bar graph. This is not a floating bar graph. And you notice that it starts at 0, and these are the temperatures in Fahrenheit. And in summer, we're never going to see temperatures at 0. Just won't see it. You're not going to see temperatures in the winter. You may not see temperatures at 50, but sometimes that does happen. And maybe in the spring you won't see temperatures at 0. Again, it depends on where you live. So in New York, we're probably not going to see 0 degrees in summer. Right? And what it means is it's almost like a box and whisker. When we did a box and whisker plot, we had a minimum and we had a maximum, if you remember. So, for example, in summer, you can have maybe the minimum degrees is, let's say, 60, and the max could be, let's say, 100, depending where you live. So that would be a floating bar graph. It wouldn't start at 0. Bring that up. Okay? So floating bar graphs look like they're floating. That's why they call them floating bar graphs. So here's a floating bar graph, and these are temperatures, and these are the temperatures in November. Probably can't see these. But you notice that at different days in November, the low and the high, the minimum and the maximum, it changed, right? So it's floating. So that's what it looks like. So let's take one, for example. Let's take one for the temperature again. And we can see this is floating, and these are the temperatures, January to December. And we'll say this is 10 degrees, if you can see that. We'll make this 15 degrees. We'll make it 20 degrees, because that's 30. We'll make that 40. That's 50, so we'll make that 60, and we'll make that 80 degrees. 20, 40, 60, 80. So now we can ask certain questions, and we can make an inequality statement. So if I gave you this question, what was the temperature in July? So here's July, and the temperature in July, the minimum was 60, and the maximum was 80. You see that? So I can write here, the X will represent the temperature. You can write T if you want. And here's the minimum, and that's the max. So this is saying that the temperature was less than or equal to 60. Oh, excuse me. The temperature was greater or equal to 60, and it was also less than or equal to 80. And on our graph, we can graph that also. We can graph, let's say that's 40, and that's 50, and that's 60, 70, 80. We'll just put a couple of numbers here. We can put 2 circles here, fill them in because we're saying that they could be that, and you'll get a graph like that. So the temperature could be 60, could be 80. That was the temperature range in July. It could have been 60, it could have been 80. So again, the temperature was greater than or equal to 60, and also less than or equal to 80, and you would write it like that. So now I can ask you a question, you can do the same thing. What was the temperature in September? So let's go back to the graph. Here's the graph. Find September and write a statement, an inequality statement. Okay, so you can see in September, here's September, right, we have a 50 degree minimum and a 70 degree maximum. So how would you write that? So we're going to say the temperature, and we can use X, and we have a 50 degree and a 70 degree. Double check that, right? 50 and 70. Now, we're saying it could be 70 or greater, and it could be 50 or greater. It could be 70 or less. So that's how you would write it. So that's writing a floating bar graph. And on the graph itself, if you made a line, right, and let's say you started with 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, you can say that it could have been 50, and it could have been 70. And that would be our bar graph. Now, if you saw something like this, let's say you saw something on a graph like this, how would you write this? How would you write that if you saw that on a graph? Bring it down. Well, here, again, you're going to put x in the middle, and you're saying now that x has to be greater than 10, not equal to, because it's not filled in. But it has to be less than or equal to what? 25. Let's do one more. So let's say you saw this on a graph, and we'll just go by 5s. We'll make the graph there. And then we'll say you saw something like this. How would you write that? Using an inequality symbol. Okay, well, again, we can use x. We know we're going to use 10 and we're going to use 30. We're saying that x can be 10, so it's greater or equal to 10. But it can't be 30. It has to be just less than 30. Okay, that's floating bar graphs. Great job.